Hello, everybody. My name's Alan Levine. Together with Tom Merrill, I run the Political Theory Institute here at American University. Welcome to our 25th anniversary year of political theory lectures from American University. I just want to call to your attention to events later on this semester. On November 11th, we have Anika Prather speaking about the Black classical tradition. And on December 2nd, we have Ben and Jenna Story talking about why we are restless, the modern quest for contentment. But today, we are very fortunate to have with us one of the United States' and indeed the world's leading public intellectuals. Francis Fukuyama is the Olivier Namalini Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and the Mosbacher Director of its Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. His 1992 book, The End of History and the Last Man, has appeared in over 20 foreign editions and launched him to worldwide renown. He's the author of 10 books overall and the editor or co-editor of 7 others. His most recent publication is Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment, with the 10th, Liberalism and its Discontents, forthcoming this spring. Fukuyama was previously a member of the Political Science Department of the Rand Corporation, on the policy planning staff of the U.S. Department of State, and a member of the President's Council on Bioethics. He previously taught at George Mason University and at the NITSA School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins. He earned his BA from Cornell in classics and his PhD in political science from Harvard, and he's been awarded 6 honorary doctorate degrees. While living in DC, he was in the audience for some of PTI events, and so it's a special pleasure to welcome him onto our stage to talk about populism, polarization, and national identity. So Frank, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thanks very much for inviting me, Alan.
Yeah. I want to begin today by revisiting the end of history thesis, because as you undoubtedly know, until your dying day, you're going to be the end of history guy. And not Marx, not Hegel, that's you. But when people talk about it, they often talk about it without understanding what you were talking about, I think. Anytime some semi-significant event happens, a new law, election, a riot, a disease, some commentator frames their writing by saying how this disproves Fukuyama's end of history because something happened, right? That's a big understanding, I think. You were talking not about the end of any particular event, but the telos, or the goal of history, the final stage in human development in the Marxist Hegelian sense. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the way that I would put it today is that history is meant in the sense of modernization or development. So there's been this massive evolution in the nature of human societies over the centuries and millennia. And it does seem to be directional. We're not simply running around in circles. And then the question is, where is that pointing to? So the end of history was, I wouldn't say it's a telos in the Aristotelian sense, but it's a question of where does that seem to be terminating? You know, what kind of society do we get at the end of that process? And when I wrote the original article, it was in the late 1980s. And for the past 150 years before that, Marxists had been saying the end of history is going to be communism. It seemed to me in the winter of 88, 89 that wasn't going to happen. And it doesn't look any more likely to happen at this point. And if it's not communism, then it's going to be the penultimate stage, which would be some version of liberal democracy connected to a market economy. So that's the sense in which I meant it. And, you know, I still think it's a valid question whether there's anything that's going to transcend the kind of political order that we see around us today.
Yeah. And you just there said a legitimate question of the end of history, and the original article had a question mark at the end of history question mark. And then the book that it became was The End of History and the Last Man, with the last man, I think, replacing the question mark, right? That there's something about liberal democracy that very well could devolve or not be satisfying to everyone, that would lead to a breakthrough of a kind of Nietzschean Superman to something completely new, right? So as you sit here today, do you still think that, I mean, I know it's a question, but as you sit here today, do you feel like, yeah, this is pretty much it, that everything is pointing towards this and this is where it's going to rest? Or are you still open to the possibility of a whole new something totally different coming?
Well, neither of those positions, I think.
Okay.
So obviously, the world is really different from what it was like in 89 or 91, when I published that book. Democracy is really not doing well. The latest country to suffer a military coup just yesterday was Sudan. And so there's been a whole string of setbacks. The world had gone from about 35 democracies to like 120 by the early 2000s. But since then, that number has fallen in a big reverse wave. And I think, to me, the more troubling developments are actually in the United States and in other established democracies, where you've seen the rise of populist movements that threaten especially the liberal part of liberal democracy. So in that respect, I think that the world is really quite different. In another respect, however, I'm not sure that I have, in all that period, seen an alternative that actually plausibly presents itself as superior. I've been saying this for the last 30 years, that the only alternative regime that could plausibly make that case for itself is that of China. So they have a clearly authoritarian political system. They're stable. They've produced massive economic growth. They've gotten a lot of people out of poverty. A lot of people seem to like having jobs and living in this kind of a country. But I still don't believe that this represents a model to which other countries are going to gravitate over time, partly because, what I know about China is that it's a kind of unique model, unique to China itself, given China's history and particular conditions. It's not easily transferred anywhere. And they also don't have this kind of messianic liberal communist belief that their system is going to spread to, the furthest corners of the world. They want to be the dominant player in their part of the world, but they don't think that everybody has to be like them. So for a whole variety of reasons, I don't think we're in this situation where there's this alternative form of government waiting in the wings that is going to displace our form of government.
No, clearly no alternative government waiting in the wings. But I know this is touching on your next book, which I don't really want to quite go into right now, but you're not worried that there's sufficient discontent from within liberal democracy that it will crumble on its own with the will to create something new?
Yeah. So I actually rewrote The End of History. I did this 2-volume series on political order. The first one was The Origins of Political Order that I published in 2011. And then the second volume, From the French Revolution to the Present, called Political Order and Political Decay. And that's the first time that I started talking about political decay, the idea that democracies are not necessarily stable and that they can go backwards. Now, the second volume was written in 2014, before the rise of Trump and all of these populists all over the world. But even at that point, it seemed to me that parts of the American state had really been captured by various interest groups that the system was extremely rigid. It was having a great deal of time fixing obvious problems that it was encountering. And if that continued, it's not clear that it would be stable. Then after its publication, we had this whole populist revolution. And the homeland of that revolution, of all places, was in the United States, which had led the liberal revolution on the upside. And so I don't any longer take for granted the idea that this regime is going to be around forever. Comparative political scientists, had this concept of consolidated democracy. And at this point, I think that's just BS. I mean, I think that you can go backwards as well as forward. And, I'm quite frankly worried about what the future holds, not just for, marginal democracies that have democratized in the last 20 years, but, for some of the oldest and what seem to be the most stable democracies.
Yeah, it's interesting to me that you talked about diagnosing the problem in the Political Order and Political Decay book, because I would have said you started it a lot earlier, that even in your 1995 book, Trust, you have a 50-page section on American society and the crisis of trust, right? So that's 26 years ago. And it seems to me that your work has touched on decay in the United States, and among other places too, but in the United States in particular, throughout this entire period. If we come up to today, the present moment, what would you say now are the causes of the polarization in the US today?
Well, that's a big question. Let me just back up a little bit because, right from the end of history, I always argued that liberal democracy or the particular regime that we have in the United States succeeded not simply because of the formal institutions like the Constitution and the rule of law that we had established, but there is also a kind of sociological dimension. This is why I always admired Tocqueville as one of the greatest political thinkers, because
all my students out there pay attention to
yes.
that.
But what Tocqueville did was he analyzed the formal institutions, but he said that they needed to be supported by a set of informal norms and really what was called social capital, this ability of people to work together, to trust one another. And you couldn't take that for granted. And I think that what's happened is that you've seen this big erosion in certainly the levels of trust in American society. When I wrote the book Trust back in 1996, America was one of the great examples of a high trust society, because in all of the cross-national surveys, if you ask people, do you generally trust, other fellow citizens, a country like France or China came out very, very low, and the United States was always relatively high. And I would say that that's really it's just not true any longer. That, we've had this kind of monotonically increasing distrust. The biggest source of distrust is just for the state itself. I mean, and we're at a point where it's absolutely pathological. The rise of anti-vax hysteria in this country is fundamentally about the government, right? That people think that the government is up to some really nefarious end in promoting vaccines, and that's really why they don't want to be forced to take them. And it's also distrust of fellow citizens. And so the polarization that you mentioned is, just a huge weakness that has divided American society and made it, certainly much less of a significant player internationally, because we can't agree on, passing a yearly budget, and we don't agree on foreign policy, and, we have a certain part of our populace that actually likes Russia better than they like the other parties. So all of these things, have occurred that really have to do with the changing social and moral conditions on which American democracy was built. So if you get into the questions of why this polarization exists, I think that there have classically been two explanations put forward. The one is pretty straightforwardly economic. It really has to do with the liberal world order, created a lot of wealth, but it went to a handful of oligarchs and billionaires, didn't trickle down to ordinary people. In the meantime, you had outsourcing and the loss of working class jobs and a lack of respect for, people that didn't have high degrees of education. And that created a lot of resentment that a lot of the elites, like you and me sitting here in universities, were pretty much immune to and oblivious to. So that's part of it. The other part is cultural, which has to do with this issue of identity. And it's really about recognition. So in identity, I go through a lot of the intellectual history of the idea of identity, that it really does arise out of what Plato called thumos, or Socrates called thumos, this sense of pride that each one of us has that demands that other people recognize our fundamental dignity, and produces very strong emotions of resentment and anger when it's not recognized. And that this had been exacerbated by the economic disparities in the country, but it was also driven by the cultural divisions in which people with good educations were simply looking down on people that weren't like themselves, didn't understand that they could have traditional values, that they could be religious, that they could have strong commitments about family life and other moral values, and that was then driving this tremendous anger against elites. I would say at this point it's gotten much crazier than that, because when I wrote Identity, I published it in 2018, so a couple of years after Trump's election, and at that point you could talk about these kind of sociological drivers of the rise of populism. I think that now we've gotten into much crazier territory where I don't think, so if you say, well, what's the Republican Party today? It's a party of anti-vaxxers, or it's the party that believes that the last election was stolen. I mean, the commitments, the deep commitments of Republicans have just become completely unmoored from the old issues like low taxes and limited government and sort of political principles that had defined the party, and now are much more driven by a cult of personality around the former president, about these kind of crazy theories about elite conspiracies against ordinary people. And so I would say that that then you have to explain by other things. So there's been a lot of social psychology being adduced to explain this. But I think also, quite frankly, technology has played a big role, because today we have created this digital universe in which anybody can say anything, right? The elites have lost complete control of any of the narratives that are out there that they held as little as 6, 7, 8, 10 years ago. And essentially anyone can say anything. And what that leads to is not a relativism with regard to fundamental values. It leads to this relativism, regarding facts, like, did the Democrats steal the November 2020 election? And right now, if you go on the internet and type into a Google search bar, was the 2020 election legitimate, you'll get 10,000 hits of websites that will purport to tell you why it was a stolen election. And so you're living in this very weird world in which you have this apparent cultural and value conflict that is riding on top of epistemic division of the world, where people are beginning from opposite facts. And so people on the right, the MAGA crowd, thinks that they're defending democracy. They think that democracy was stolen by Joe Biden, and Joe Biden's supporters think exactly the opposite, and only one of those can be true.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to just tell the audience, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A function, and we'll be going. My conversation with Frank will be going on for another 20 minutes or so, and then we hope to have lots of time for Q&A. So I want to tease a few threads out of what you just talked about, and one of them is you talked about for the main theories today to explain the mess we're in. One is economic, and one is more psychological, I guess you would say, based on identity and recognition. And of those two, you think that, I don't know if you still think this, but in 2018 at least, you thought that the demand for dignity was by far the more important than the economic. Do you stay with that? And can you explain to us why you think that's the case?
Well, one thing to say is that it's sometimes hard to disentangle the two. So if you lose your job because it's been outsourced to China, you lose social status and you lose respect in the eyes of your neighbors and family and friends. So you're also suffering a blow to your dignity, because people's sense of self-worth is really based on what they do for a living, the fact that somebody's willing to pay them a wage to do what they do, and the like. So the two are very closely interconnected. But the reason that I think that the cultural stuff is more important just has to do with some empirical facts about the way that people have voted. So in 2016, the median income of Trump voters is actually higher than that of Democratic voters. And so there are definitely a core group of his supporters that were these out of work working class types. But he really won the election because there were a lot of conservatives who feared what the left would do. They saw him as the only obstacle to getting the sorts of things they wanted. Some of them were traditional Republican policy objectives like lower taxes or deregulation or limits on immigration. But a lot of it was really driven by this cultural fear that somehow American national identity was being deeply, deeply threatened by the progressive left, by the woke progressive left. And, I guess a lot of this just comes out of talking to conservative friends of mine, many of whom really don't particularly like or admire Trump, but they still voted for him, or they're still sympathetic because they feel that there is a much deeper cultural threat coming from basically identity politics. And from the intolerance of woke progressives, from a kind of ideology that has surrounded gender identity, race, and the like, and that this is really threatening to many fundamental American values, and that's really it's kind of the fear of the cultural advance of those sorts of ideas that is driving them to vote Republican. And I just see confirmation of this all the time, from people that are perfectly secure in their jobs and not really being economically displaced, but really do care about the cultural stuff.
Okay. I want to step back and talk about the meaning of identity right, to an individual and then to groups. And you mentioned thumos, this idea from Plato's Republic, the so-called third part of the soul. Everyone today understands reason as a part of the soul, and everyone understands desire or desires as part of the soul. But Plato talks about this other thing, thumos, that you actually have been writing about since the end of history book, but you put it front and center in the demand for dignity and recognition in your identity book. So can you just say a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, well, that's very appropriate for a political theory discussion. So I think the concept of identity rests on three separate ideas. So one of them is thumos. I mean, this is just an aspect of human psychology, and it's one that the economists don't understand at all. I mean, they see reason and they see desire. They don't see thumos, and their models don't encompass this, this demand for recognition. A second component is what I call this idea of an inside and an outside to every human being. And in identity, I kind of trace the genesis of this because I think that it actually starts in a certain way with Martin Luther, because Luther said that Christian faith is not visible from the outside. It is not visible in terms of the good works that one does, saying the rosary or going to mass and being absolved. It really is an inner state of being that may be hidden from the believer himself or herself. And so this starts this long process, and Charles Taylor writes about this, I think quite intelligently. This kicks off this long process in Western thought of a belief that each individual holds inside them an inner self that is oftentimes hidden, but that is the authentic being. And then I think it's really Rousseau that produces a secular version of this, where he talks about the plenitude of feeling of natural man. In the discourse on inequality, he says that people were not social creatures. Initially, they were happy because they were isolated, and they could, in a sense, be in touch with these authentic selves. But all of a sudden, once you get into society, you start comparing yourself. I'm thinking about Facebook, and all the likes, on Instagram, I mean, that's just the latest technological version of that. But, Rousseau basically anticipated Instagram by saying, we human beings made ourselves miserable by being able to compare ourselves to one another and establishing all of these false social rules and expectations against which we measure ourselves, and, we're miserable as a result. And that human happiness lies in the authentic expression of that inner self. And then, finally, you have a different understanding of dignity, right? So dignity doesn't really exist in the Anglo-Saxon lexicon of Hobbes and Locke and Jefferson and so forth. I think that, it has Latin roots, and it's basically rooted in a lot of Catholic thought, where dignity, it's not just Catholic. I mean, it really comes out of a kind of Judeo-Christian understanding of human beings, that, Adam and Eve are kicked out of the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis because God gives them a command and they disobey it, right? And it's that capacity for moral choice that then defines human beings as being higher than the rest of nature, which simply follows instinct, but lower than God because they can actually choose wrongly. But from that point forward, it's that capacity for choice that is come to be seen as uniquely human. And then as time goes on, this is defined, initially in Christian terms, but then, with someone like Immanuel Kant or Epigone, John Rawls, the act of choice, in a sense becomes absolutized as the core of what it means to be a human being. And a lot of modern liberalism is built around this notion that it's autonomy, that A makes us equal and B gives us dignity. And so when you wrap all these things together, the inner self, the need for recognition, dignity being based on autonomy, you get this modern notion of identity, that, we're all beings that have hidden inner selves that are authentic, that are seeking recognition, that society generally suppresses those inner beings, and therefore suppresses our happiness, and that we will be made happy by, having choice, of being able to express, the authentic choice of that inner being. And, that then becomes the foundation of modern identity politics.
Right. And this all trickles down to what you call expressive individualism and therapeutic man. Could you just say a little bit about that?
Well, it takes two different forms. So one kind of ends up in the hippie movement of the 1960s, this idea that we are um, that we're deeply creative individuals, and our autonomy is not simply, the sense of Luther or Kant that we can follow a predetermined moral rule or not, but rather that we have the freedom to make up those moral rules themselves. And that, is our friend Friedrich Nietzsche's contribution, that, the most free individual is Zarathustra, the person that revalues all values, because ultimately that's the highest form of freedom. And then, in Casey versus Pennsylvania, Justice Kennedy actually has a version of this where he says, liberty is basically the right to assert, your own values and to create your own moral universe and so forth. And so that, that idea that autonomy includes the ability to shape, your own moral rules, then becomes embedded in American jurisprudence and in the American understanding of the constitutionally protected realm of choice that the Constitution protects. But then the other direction it goes off into is in group recognition, where a lot of people, beginning with the social movements of the 1960s, begin to say, well, actually, what I am on the inside has been shaped by prejudice, by racism, by sexism, by patriarchy, by all of these social forces that have molded me into, a being, and I have to, that's who I am, and therefore I need to show solidarity with other people that have been, categorized, and so that begins to then be the basis for critiquing the liberal individualism of the Hobbes, Locke, Jefferson understanding of liberal identity.
And what do you consider to be the pros and cons, or the legitimate parts and the worrying parts of that kind of progressive identity politics?
So this is something I've been wrestling with a lot in the last few years. And I would say the following. I think that there is a good version of identity politics that is actually the fulfillment of liberalism, in which we recognize that although our liberal societies are committed to the rule of law and to the equal treatment of human beings as human beings, that we don't live up to it, and that we marginalize people, we don't treat people in fact, equally. And what identity politics is a way of mobilizing those people that have been marginalized and getting them to push back and use the political system to have their rights, equal rights recognized. So that's one version. And that, I think, is quite legitimate. There's another version, however, that is now being adopted, I'm sorry to say, by a lot of my students, but certainly by a lot of woke progressives, that actually accepts the fact that we're divided into these kind of indelible groups, and that recognition really has to be given to groups rather than to individuals, and that the group identity, especially those that are established according to fixed characteristics like race, gender, ethnicity, gender identity, and so forth, are the essential characteristics about any individual that are more important than their individual characteristics. And that's where I think a lot of identity politics is actually turned against liberalism. It denies one of the most fundamental tenets of liberal theory, which is that we are equal individuals.
Okay, and how? And so, but what are the negative consequences that come out of that that bad kind of identity politics?
Well, look, I don't have to tell you the stuff that's been going on, especially on university campuses. So the first thing I think that in the way that it gets manifested is through intolerance, right? So toleration is the cardinal liberal virtue, because basically liberalism is a system for living with diversity. We don't all have to agree on the most important things. We have to agree on a framework of law by which, we live in peace together. But, a lot of progressives have now become intolerant because they don't want to tolerate people that they believe discriminate on the basis of gender, race, ethnicity, so on and so forth. That's one thing. But I think the other problem is that, you're shifting towards a society where, you bake into law this idea that your group identity is more important than your individual identity. And that leads then to, down that road lies Lebanon or Bosnia, or one of these societies in which the whole politics is the politics of these different identity groups. And, all of them believe that they're in a kind of zero-sum competition against one another, for state resources. And, we're not quite there yet in the United States, but, that is the logical endpoint of following this kind of group recognition path.
Yeah, in your book Identity, you mentioned a couple of other points, which I just maybe will raise, and you can comment on whichever ones you want. But I think you talk also about that by focusing on identity, it replaces thinking on structural economic issues, which are real. It ignores other groups who suffer, like the white working class, that it threatens free speech, the rational discourse that's needed to sustain democracy, and it stimulates a corresponding identity politics on the right.
All of those things are absolutely true. I think that, we're living in that kind of a world right now. I think that what I would add that is added in my new book on liberalism is this cognitive shift also that explains some of the polarization that we're living in the midst of. Because, beginning with postmodernist writers, all these French postmodernist writers, you had the injection of a great deal of subjectivism into our understanding of human cognition, that there was a systematic attempt to say that the Enlightenment understanding of, rational empirical thought was itself part of a power structure that was marginalizing people. And, I think the single person that was the most responsible for the spread of this idea was Michel Foucault. His biopower idea says that essentially power pervades everything, including modern natural science. And he gives many examples of incarceration, of mental illness, that, he says use the facade of modern science to actually dominate other people, that it was simply a kind of hoax or in a sense, an elite conspiracy. And that idea spread, all over the left. But now it's being taken up on the right. It's funny, I wrote another blog post about this, saying in which I said that I didn't think that anybody in the Trump White House was all that familiar with Foucault. But then somebody then responded to me and said, no, that's not true, actually. There's several speechwriters in the White House that actually make reference to Foucault, and it's not that far from some of the things that Steve Bannon has said. And basically, it's a skepticism about science, that science is really not objective, that it's fundamentally a matter of power and of elites that want to use their power not, as Foucault says, they used to just kill people. They used to be much more open with power. Now they want to hide that power behind the facade of a supposedly neutral and objective science. And, you have to be aware that that's what they're doing to you. And I think that explains a lot of our cognitive craziness these days.
Okay, so in the course of that answer, you shifted from the identity politics on the left to the identity politics on the right, and you talked about the identity politics on the right a little bit earlier. that people who see the traditional idea of national identity being undermined. And also immigration plays a large role in this. Can you talk about those two things?
Sure. There are different versions of national identity in the course of American history, and quite frankly, national identity was built around race. Only white men with property were allowed to vote after the ratification of the Constitution, and it took a very bloody civil war to give African Americans citizenship, and then another 100 years of Jim Crow for that promise actually to be realized. And so there's always been this fight in American history over who qualifies as a rights-bearing individual. And I would say we've made a lot of progress in that period. I mean, the Declaration has that great phrase about all men being created equal. And I think, as Abraham Lincoln argued against Stephen Douglas, that supersedes the democratic choice that the Southern states were making, that would legalize slavery. And so you've seen the circle of people that were regarded as full human beings, steadily increase. But I would say that right now it still is a neuralgic issue. And so I want to be very clear about this, because I do think that there are generalizations about the right that I think are really, some of them are perfectly justified and others are overblown. There is an interpretation that says that the whole MAGA phenomenon are basically privileged white people that see that the country is changing racially, demographically, and they're losing their privilege and they're reacting against that. And, I think that is probably true of, that guy that was carrying the Confederate flag into the U.S. Capitol building. And so there definitely is, a group that sees race as primary. There's another probably bigger group that sees actually Christianity as one of the key components of American identity. And that obviously has been diluted greatly by the fact that there's other religions, there are Jews, there's Hindus, there's a lot of young people that don't profess any religion at all. So that has been under threat. And then finally, I think that there are people that feel that liberalism itself has kind of undermined belief in an American idea that was not racial or religious, but it's been a kind of acid that's made it impossible for people to be patriotic, because there's a certain version of liberalism that really doesn't like the nation at all, and that feels that we are really members of a global community, and our first allegiance should be to this global citizenship, and not as citizens of the country. And the policy manifestation of this is obviously in immigration policy, because that hits on this demographic issue most directly. My own personal opinion, I think immigration has been great for the United States, but I also think that countries ought to be able to control it. And there's a certain part of the right-wing base that just doesn't like the fact that these non-white people are coming into the country. But I think there's a larger part of that coalition that actually doesn't like the fact that we don't have control over that border. And they're both part of, that voting bloc.
Okay, so just in a word, what are the legitimate concerns of the Trumpist populace?
So if I were the God King of the United States, I would do a couple of things. So I would, first of all, have a comprehensive immigration reform that set, rates of immigration that were, reasonably high, but I would actually do something about the border, not just building a wall, but you actually need a national ID system and a means of sanctioning employers that hire people that are not documented and so forth. So that would be one part of it. I would think seriously about protecting certain working class occupations. There are other industrialized countries that do that much better than we do in the United States, in particular, Germany and Japan, both of which have held on to a manufacturing sector much better than we have because they actually give dignity to various forms of what we call low skilled labor, but which is actually quite high skilled. We just, people that go to universities just don't recognize that it's actually not that easy to be a really skilled truck driver or mechanic or so forth. Whereas in Germany, you've got an apprenticeship system where you have to take like a 2-year course in order to be a retail shop clerk or a baker or, somebody like that. And which, what I find brilliant about that system is it's all about dignity. It's all about thumos and recognition that, Walmart gives you 2 days worth of training before they put you out on the floor as a retail clerk. In Germany, you actually go to school, you get a certificate, you're given training, and that, gives you a certain kind of clear status within the society. And I think that, we need to think about ways that, look to enhance the dignity of different forms of labor. And I think, essentially, we have to roll back a lot of the economic neoliberalism. I think that the rise of the Chicago School led to this kind of anti-statist religion that has infected a lot of people, including a lot of people on the left, that I think was very destructive in many ways. If there's one thing that I've focused a lot of my writing and research around, it's actually the state, because I actually think having a modern state, an impersonal, capable modern state is a pretty important thing, and we don't do that well in the United States. And so I would bolster that state and bolster its ability to actually provide, kind of critical social services.
Yeah, and the third term of our title for today is national identity, which is kind of your solution to the identity-driven politics of the left and the right that have both sort of erred and taken us into the polarized world in which we're in today, right? And so can you talk a little bit about national identity?
Yeah, so national identity has a bad reputation because it is connected to aggressive and intolerant nationalism. And I think that in a liberal society, you need national identity, but it has to be liberal national identity, meaning that it has to be built around liberal constitutionalism, about reverence for the rule of law, about a structured order that allows individuals to flourish, and it cannot be based on things like ethnicity, race, gender, these fixed characteristics that people have no control over. And I think that, we had really shifted towards that understanding of identity after the civil rights era. I remember as a kid growing up in New York City, I mean, there are hardly any other Asians that I ever met, when I was young. And, somebody would make fun of me for being Asian at school. And, my father would say, just tell them that you're an American, right? That's who you are. You're proud to be an American. You're just as American as that other kid is, and that's something that you can be proud of. And I think that that is actually the kind of understanding of American identity that we had arrived at. And unfortunately, now we're kind of moving backwards in a certain sense. And so on the right, you have, certain part of the right that actually does want to return to a more ethnically or racially based understanding of who's an American. And then on the left, you have progressives that say that, yes, there's a national identity, but it's patriarchal and racist and so forth. And I think, what I would like to see is a national narrative, and I just don't think that this is so hard to get to, that is neither 1619 nor the 1776 Commission that says, the United States was born in this original sin of slavery and racism, but it has also this liberal heritage of equality, and that progressively over time we have managed to tear down a lot of the barriers that different groups have faced to participating in that equality, and we still have a long ways to go, but that's our ideal, and that's what our national identity is built around. But unfortunately, it's really hard to articulate something like that right now, because the polarization has said that you got to choose one of these narratives or the other.
And you want both. You're not
I
saying
want both.
third. You want both.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Yeah.
we shouldn't kid ourselves that
Right.
we have these terrible things in our national past, but I also think we shouldn't kid ourselves that we've also made things better. So both of those things you can believe simultaneously.
Yeah. Well, PTI here is running our first Summer Civics Institute for high school teachers this summer. So we're trying to address that. You had a few other ideas to create national identity. You talked about, in addition to sort of civics training and strong border control, and what went along with border control was also legalizing the status of the undocumented workers,
Yeah.
and maybe making that palatable to conservatives by having those people do some term of national service. And you also like national service for everybody too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, those are several different ideas. I mean, look, the comprehensive immigration reform has been on the table ever since the 1980s, in which you basically you legalize people that are here already and grandfather them in, based on their length of residence, in return for actually having serious controls over who comes into the country. And they tried that in this immigration reform in the late 1980s, and they only did the legalization part. They didn't really control the border. And so I think that you could still, in theory, do this and have effective employer sanctions, for example, together with legal, fairly generous quotas for new immigrants, and legalize the people that are here already. That's been on the table. They tried to do this in the George W. Bush administration, and the thing failed. But that's a clear, that would be a clear step forward. The part about national service is simply this: that we tend to think about rights as the basis of our citizenship, and we don't think about duties. We don't think about what citizens owe each other and their political system. And I think that if we had a system of national service that mixed people of different races, social classes, genders, that would be something very useful. It would be a form of social engineering. We do it already in the US military, and I think the military is actually one of the most successful national institution that really has tried to, for example, deal seriously with questions of race, because for many African Americans, it has been a route of social mobility. And so national service could serve that kind of a function. I don't think it can be mandatory. I think it would have to be voluntarily, but just getting the idea that you actually have duties as a citizen and not just rights would be a very helpful step forward.
Yeah. Duties, what an idea. Okay, so we've got a lot of questions. And let me just say again to the audience, if you have questions, please put it in the Q&A function and identify yourself. Here's one from Anthony Sutton. Your early work on the end of history used a Hegelian framework. I'm interested in how that approach can still produce insight by identifying the crucial tension in a political system. Your 2014 article in Foreign Affairs, American Decay, focused on the tension between technocratic governance and democratic input. Your more recent book, Identity, looked at the tension between generic liberalism and the psychological need for a particularized identity. So a conjoined question: Is this Hegelian method still a fruitful way to consider politics? And if so, what is the antithesis and the likely synthesis?
So that part of Hegel, the thesis, antithesis, synthesis part, I don't take all that seriously. I think that forces a kind of structure to the historical process that you kind of have to manhandle the historical facts to make them fit. The part that I do take seriously is simply that there is something like progress, that there is a kind of overall evolution of human societies and human institutions. And I would say that my view of the way that works is more Darwinian than it is Hegelian in a certain sense. That is to say that different human societies try out different forms of government, different forms of economic organization, different forms of social organization, and they compete with each other. And as a result of that competition, the weaker ones disappear and the stronger ones survive. And so that's why we all live in states, or almost all of us in the world live in states today, because previously you would have this tribal form of organization that was better than living in bands. But when it came up against state power, it really, wasn't adequate. And so, everybody made the transition to living in a state level society. So that's really the mechanism that I see kind of driving human social evolution. And I'm not sure that the Hegelian notion, I think in retrospect, I would say there's two weaknesses. One is just the idealism that, there is a material side to this evolution that Hegel, kind of projects an idealistic gloss onto, which I think is not quite right. But what he absolutely gets right is the centrality of recognition. That what really is driving this process is the demand, that people be recognized, and that many of the great struggles in human history are really struggles over recognition, including the rise of modern democracy.
Okay, I've got two questions now, and then I'm going to put together. I'm only going to read one at a time, but the first one is a view from the right, and then we'll take one sort of from the left. This one is from Paul Ludwig, our good friend from St. John's College, Annapolis. One aspect of polarization is each side egging on the other to greater and greater excesses. To what degree do you think it would have been possible for the progressive left to be more moderate, e.g., not to redefine marriage, not to redefine gender, etc.? Was this all inevitable and the right-wing reaction to it also inevitable? Or was there a road not taken for, say, progressives or for cultural conservatives?
I think that there are several choices that were made that did make the situation worse. For example, I believe that abortion should be legalized, but I think that it was a huge mistake to do it via the courts. I think that people that were pro-abortion, it was being legalized on a state-by-state basis at the time of Roe v. Wade, but they saw this as a way of leapfrogging that whole, painstaking legislative process, and at a single stroke, pushing ahead. And then Obergefell, with gay marriage was a similar kind of leapfrogging. And I think that added greatly to the bitterness, because in addition to people that didn't like the substance of the policy, people also became very resentful that this was not being done in a democratic fashion, and that people with very strong moral commitments on the other side were simply steamrolled by the courts. And so I actually think in retrospect that it would have been a lot better had this been done, legislatively rather than by judicial edict. And I would support, a future court that actually was a little bit less activist in this regard. Whether leadership would matter in terms of egging people on, I think it would. The leading examples of this can be, woke progressives. I would say that we had a certain ex-president that was pretty good at triggering people in the most extreme manner that he could. And I think that, a lot of the bitterness that has exploded in the last 5 years, is the fact that a lot of politicians, ambitious politicians, saw this kind of, personal invective as a means of getting themselves noticed and building their bases, and that didn't have to happen.
Okay. We have a question from Professor Carl Levine in his School of International Service class. The whole class has been watching our conversation, and I lost the actual question. I apologize for it, but it was something to the effect of questioning the idea that the populism on the right was a reaction to the left, that wasn't there sort of white identity politics under Reagan and Nixon.
So there was white identity politics all along. The Ku Klux Klan is white identity politics, but you have to go back to what my definition of identity politics is. So I think, as I was saying, the bad form of identity politics is when you believe that a fixed identity is essential. It's not just another characteristic that we have, like our occupation or our job or, where we choose to live, but it's really fundamental to the way that we see ourselves. And I would say that in that sense, white identity politics existed in the South. Nathan Bedford Forrest was a Confederate general that after the end of the Civil War went on to found the Ku Klux Klan. And for him and other basically unreconciled Southerners, being a white person was the most important thing. And so there's no question that for that group of people, white identity politics was very powerful. The Klan has existed ever since then, so have all these other white identity groups. And I would say in the South, race still is an important marker, but is race essential to the way that, the vast majority of white Americans see themselves? I don't think so. I think that, most white Americans outside of, that region say, well, I'm an American, I happen to be white, but, there are more important things about me, like where I went to school and what my job is and that sort of thing. So I think it's true that white identity politics has existed. It's true that, conservative politicians have used, fears about race, the Willie Horton stuff, with George H.W. Bush and so forth. But, for those people, that was just never front and center in the way that they thought of themselves, the way it is now, I think, with a lot of kind of much more overtly, white nationalist people. And I do think, I've just run into too many people that have been, really kind of driven into the arms of these populists by, what they see as excesses on the progressive left.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Tom Jaldry, who is an AU alum. He went on to grad school in literature. I don't know if he's still there or a practicing professor. He says, you haven't yet addressed the centrality of racial grievance and the decline of faith in democratic liberalism and rise of Trump's right-wing identity politics, Mexican rapists, shithole countries, etc. What exacerbated these white grievances? And do you see Kendi-style anti-racism as a way to attenuate these differences or an intensification of racial tribalism and group resentment?
Well, I did mention, race. What I said was that you have to pick apart the MAGA coalition or the Trump, I wouldn't say the MAGA coalition is actually a small part of the, whatever it is, 70 million people that voted for Trump. But I do think that among those voters, you've got to distinguish because you do have a hardcore of people for whom issues like race were really primary, right? Those were the January 6th types. And then you had a lot of other people for whom other issues were more important. And as I was saying, voting against what they saw as an intolerant form of the progressive left was one of the issues that was driving them to vote Republican. I think that for anybody that thinks that race and ethnicity were the primary drivers of the Trump vote, they need to ask themselves, if you look at the actual voting that took place last November, why is it that so many Hispanics voted for Trump? Because the proportion went way up. And in fact, the proportion of African Americans voting for him went up. Even the number of American Muslims voting for Trump went up, right? And they were voting for, a lot of those people were clearly voting against Trump himself because they didn't like his style of politics, but they were voting for down ballot Republican candidates. And a lot of those Republicans did a lot better than Trump did because they didn't have his kind of abrasive characteristics and so forth. And so those are all reasons why I think that, you got to be kind of careful about generalizations you make about that particular voting bloc. Now, I think someone like Ibrahim Kendi has been largely a negative, force. I mean, unfortunately, in my view, the discussion about racial politics has gone backwards in many respects because, having sat through the version of this discussion back in the 1980s in the wake of the Great Society, it's always seemed to me that, the highly disparate and frustratingly unequal outcomes that we see, between racial groups today has really complex, causes, that some of which are the result of just overt racism, but others are, due to historical legacies, due to institutional, conditions. American federalism plays a role in all of this. There's a lot of things that feed into those outcomes. And if you get somebody that says that basically everything is monocausal and can simply be traced back to white racism, I think kind of sets back the discussion. And for a whole variety of reasons. I mean, there's a kind of substantive intellectual reason, because I think that's not true. I think these things are actually quite complicated and multi-causal. But I think it's also bad politics, because I think that really turns off a lot of those, swing voters, who are the ones, by the way, that, got Joe Biden elected, that are not hardcore MAGA types, but, they really dislike a lot of the rhetoric that they see coming out of the left. And I think so for those pragmatic political reasons, that hasn't been helpful.
We have one more question on race from a student. Why should we consider race a fixed identity rather than something subject to more constructivist forces?
So race is, it is to some extent socially constructed, but there is a biological reality to it. I mean, the people that say that it is simply socially constructed are usually talking about, kind of borderline cases where you have, people of mixed racial identity with ancestors that, span different kinds of racial groups. And for a lot of those, they do have a certain amount of choice in identifying with, their mother or their father or with a certain set of ancestors and the like. But to say that race is a completely socially constructed category, I think is, it's simply not factually correct. That there is a underlying reality there. But I think, the general idea that we do not have to organize ourselves by biological categories is absolutely correct. that is the big mistake that nationalists made, that think that biology is, something fixed. And I think if you look at the history of national identity, in Europe, there's so many ways of identifying, ethnic identity. Like, is a Pole in Danzig, a white person, a Pole, or actually descended from some German, Teutonic knight, and could think of themselves more as a Germanic individual. I mean, in those respects, it is really easy to change your understanding of what group you belong to in order to fit, the political realities that you're facing. And so in that respect, I think it's quite right to think of these categories as fluid and, subject to redefinition.
We have one more related question from Professor Carl Levine himself. And that is, why do we need assimilation, as you urge in the book? Why can't America have diversity within multiculturalism? Or is your critique of diversity really centered on the rise of demands for group recognition?
Yeah, it's really more the latter. I guess it depends on what you mean by assimilation. I see it as assimilation into the civic identity, that you adopt when you say the oath of nationalization, when you become an American citizen, and you forswear allegiance to other systems and, to other types of political systems. That's what I mean by assimilation. Now, there's another aspect of assimilation that is more broadly cultural, that has to do with what kind of food do you like, again, can get into what sports teams do you root for, what holidays do you celebrate. And that becomes a little bit more problematic. In the United States, a lot of what people thought of as mainstream American culture was actually defined by Christianity, for example. And, that I think can't any longer be, a core element of American identity. And certainly, you would not expect new immigrants that are not Christian to assimilate to, basically Christian ceremonies and the like. But I do think it's that civic core that's really critical.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from my colleague, Tom Merrill. An undernoted aspect of our current situation is the decline of men, for example, in universities where women far outnumber men. Do you think the crisis of masculinity has anything to do with our current polarization?
Yes, in fact, I wrote a whole book on this subject called The Great Disruption. It was probably the least noticed of all the books that I've written. I published this in, I think, 1999 or so, in which, I talked about the shift from a industrial to a post-industrial society, which in my view was the big driver of this huge shift in gender relations. And so it wasn't just an ideational thing where all of a sudden feminism took hold and people began to think about gender roles differently. It really did have to do with the fact that, as physical labor and things like upper body strength become less important as a means of earning a living, women just have a more natural role in, a post-industrial information economy. And I think that, if you talk to an HR person in a big American company and you say, would you rather hire, for a kind of typical service job as a retail clerk or, something of that sort, would you rather hire a man and a woman when they've got equal test scores and so forth? I think they'll almost inevitably pick the woman because she'll be more reliable, less problematic in terms of, kind of showing up for work on time and this sort of thing. And so women actually do have a more natural place in a post-industrial society. And, in terms of family structure, I think that led to huge changes, with the increasing divorce rates and women not wanting to live in, more patriarchal traditional families. Work for men declined as the manufacturing sector declined, and that had a huge social consequence where in many working class families the husband was unemployed or had to get a job in a at the McDonald's instead of at the factory, and actually the wife was bringing in a higher income. So all of these things were things that began to unfold as the labor market changed beginning in the late 1960s and has been accelerating that direction ever since then. And so, yes, I do think that a lot of the the reaction has been not just this racial reaction on the part of white people, but a reaction, against this more feminized world on the part of men. And it's something we got to adjust to, because it's if it's really driven as I would assert, by these fundamental economic changes, it's not something that we can just wish away and say, well, that's just a matter of cultural choice.
And there's big voting differences between men and women, right? Women vote much
Yes.
more Democratic than men, who majority is splitting.
Yeah, well, I wrote another article in Foreign Affairs in the late 1990s. I think it had the title "When Women Ruled the World," and it also pointed out that in foreign policy over many different countries, women's choices are really different from male choices. They're much less interested in investing money in defense spending, much more interested in social services, less interested in international geopolitical competition. And in general, in most countries, they're the voting bloc that really supports democracy. And so I argue that one of the reasons you were seeing the rise of democracy in many countries was the fact that women were being empowered. And certainly in the Middle East, there's going to be huge social change occurring in Iran, Saudi Arabia, countries like that, because so many women there are being educated. Even in Afghanistan, I think that one of the biggest legacies of the American 20-year occupation of that country has been the number of women that have been educated in Afghanistan. And I feel terrible for what they are going through right now, but I also think that it's possible that all of those, extremely patriarchal Muslim societies are actually going to look, quite different as a result of, of that shift in favor of women.
Thank you. We have a question from our friend Bradley Jackson, who teaches at AU and works at IHS. Could a few words be said on the likely future of the Republican Party? Is it likely to survive in the future as a party within a liberal democracy, or is it going the way of the Federalists and the Whigs?
Well, as you know, it's pretty hard to get a alternative party started given our first past the post electoral system, which is why I'm in favor of actually shifting either to ranked choice voting or to proportional representation. But that's a discussion for a different time. I think that right now, if I were a Republican, not a kind of full-on MAGA Trump supporting type, but kind of traditional Paul Ryan type of Republican, I would be really worried right now because Republican identity has been captured in a cult of personality revolving around this one guy, Donald Trump, who seems to be really leading the party off the cliff. I mean, that statement of his last week that if the injustice of the November 2020 election wasn't corrected, then he didn't think Republicans should vote in 2022 or 2024. I actually hope that a lot of Republicans listen to that, because I don't want them to, I don't want them to win in those elections. But that's not the basis on which to build a long-term party. Demographically, that's a declining base. It's aging. It's geographically becoming ever more narrow. But the more important thing is it's becoming a party that's disconnected from policy and ideas. I mean, you may not have agreed with limited government and low taxes and the sorts of things that Republicans used to say they believed in, but at least that's a coherent and defensible set of ideas. But building a party around the idea that the Democrats commit electoral fraud and that, there are these kind of QAnon type conspiracies going on. I mean, that's you can't build a national party around something like that. And that's why I think they've got a lot to worry about. I think that probably what's going to happen, well, I shouldn't attach probabilities to anything. I would say that a scenario for what could happen is that because this is not a viable platform, if not in 2024, then at some point, this whole thing is going to explode and, Republicans are just not going to do well in a future election. Or you could get this Bob Kagan type of scenario where they will hold on as a result of their being able to manipulate the electoral process itself. So despite the fact that the Democrats win, they still manage to win in the electoral college, or they win by outright manipulation of the results. And that's a really dangerous scenario, but again, not one that's healthy for the long-term survival of the party.
Okay, we've got a question about foreign policy and the theological political question. Two things that don't usually go together,
Okay.
But do you take seriously what Luttwak and David Goldman see as a serious interest by Xi in Goethe from a conversation he had with Merkel? This might mean that Xi may understand modern Western man who rejects God better than he understands himself. Is the ultimate struggle between East and West the proper understanding of theological political question? That's from Ken Masugi of the Nitsa School.
So from everything that I know about Xi Jinping himself, I don't think he reads books. He's not an intellectual. There are intellectuals, that stand behind them. I mean, there's one in particular that for the last three Chinese presidents has been kind of the chief ideologist. And then there are people like Wang Qishan, who was the head of the Central Discipline Committee for Disciplinary Control, whatever, who is a genuine intellectual. I actually had a long conversation with him a few years ago. He read Tocqueville. By the way, he's the one that had the old regime translated into Chinese, and they took it as a warning sign for what not to do if you want to avoid revolution. So there are intellectuals that have serious ideas and are quite familiar with, Western political thought. I don't think that's true of Xi Jinping. So I don't think that what he is doing is really driven, so much by ideas as by a more kind of realpolitik calculus of what, is likely to keep him and the party in power.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take two sort of more practical questions now. One is from Daniel Fram to follow up on the cultural assimilation question and civic national identity. Would you advocate retaining a consensus on, say, Columbus Day, that is, on national understandings of heroes and monuments, or do you think these kinds of questions can be ignored while we focus on a commitment to rights and institutions?
Well, with regard to the heroes and monuments, it all depends on who they are. I frankly never understood the admiration for Robert E. Lee. I mean, having lived in Northern Virginia, drove on Lee Highway all the time. And I remember there was a Lee Jackson King. I mean, when the National Martin Luther King Day was proclaimed, conservatives in Virginia linked him to two Confederate generals, which I always thought was really kind of outrageous. And so I really do think it depends on who it is. I'm perfectly in favor of renaming Fort Hood and a lot of these army bases that are named after Confederate generals. So that is okay. But I think that in general, statues should not be the main, object of contention. I think the substantive narrative that we teach children about our history is far more important than who we put up on these pedestals. And I think that's really where the big fight ought to be joined. And by the way, I mean, so I think the policies and institutions are important also, right? Obviously, as a public policy guy, I think that that's important. But I do think that the identity question is really pretty critical. It's intangible, but it really does lead to loyalty and patriotism and, a kind of unbidden virtue, when it operates in the right way. And so people do have to pay attention to the narrative that we teach young people. And so I do think that that's an appropriate locus for a lot of effort in trying to come to some kind of consensus, for the future.
Okay, here's another sort of practical question. From Philip Egan. I've been in the National Guard for 1.5 years. It has been interesting to see the Army attempt to address and accept identity politics over that time. To what degree should the military, as a fountain of national identity to those within its ranks, should address and adopt identity politics? Should their stance on an approach toward the national identity stand as an indicator of the ideal policy of the government as a whole?
So again, it depends on which version of identity politics you're talking about. And as I said, there's two of them that are quite different, right? The first version of identity politics simply says that liberal societies ought to live up to their promise of equality and provide, equality of opportunity to everybody based on, their fundamental merit and qualifications. There's the other version of identity politics that says that we should look to people's membership in certain groups as the primary thing that we know about them. And, that entails group preferences and the like. And I think that that is not anything that the military ought to be involved in. I think actually the military, of all of the institutions in the United States, is one of the most meritocratic, one of the most ruthlessly meritocratic ones out there. And, for that reason, a lot of African Americans and increasingly women have risen, in its ranks. And I think they ought to keep doing that because that sets a very good example for the rest of the country. Now, we're too close to the end of our time to get into a discussion of what actually constitutes, something like group preferences, because I think that anybody, with the least amount of sensitivity would recognize that your membership in a ascriptive group, does have consequences. And coming out of a certain group, you don't start from a level playing field. And, it's not, in my view, I mean, it's always seemed to me that there's a version of affirmative action that's perfectly acceptable, but it also has to be based on, an evaluation of the person as an individual, because many people, for example, will not score as well on a standardized exam because they grew up in a single parent family in a poor neighborhood, with no books in the house, but they're still, they've got the character and the drive, to succeed. And I think that you would not want to be rigid on, evaluating somebody like that. So it's a complicated issue, but I think the version of identity politics where you just look at a person's group membership and say that's all we're going to care about, that I think is very destructive. And I hope the military does not go in for that in any kind of big way.
We have one last question now because our time is at the end. It's from our friend Derek Webb. In the 1980s and 90s, Alan Bloom argued that young Americans were mostly value relativists. Today, arguably, that is no longer true. Americans seem more inclined to strong moral convictions and accompanying strong moral denunciations of one's opponents, as diagnosed in Jonathan Haidt's Righteous Mind. On the other hand, we seem to be experiencing a current epistemic crisis on the rise of what you're calling factual relativism. Has factual relativism replaced moral relativism?
Well, there's several components to that.
They both could still be true.
Yeah, they could both still be true. So I think what Bloom actually thought was that people in the 1960s had strong moral convictions, and then they went into this period of apathy, in the 80s and 90s, where they stopped caring about politics. And I remember him bemoaning that fact and saying that even though he disagreed with all the left-wing students, that made the Cornell crisis, he still, at least admired the fact that they did seem to have some strong political convictions. And I would say that we're back in the 1960s in many respects, because students are, more strongly opinionated, mostly on the left, but, they are more opinionated. And, it's probably good that they're mobilized along the wrong ideas in some cases, but, that's life. I'm sorry, so the second part of the question was, could you just
has
repeat
moral
that?
relativism replaced factual relativism?
No, well, I think we actually are living in an age of moral relativism. It's just that we all assume that we would still agree on basic facts, and we can't even agree on those. So, for example, I think that many Trump supporters, sincerely believe that they're defending the Constitution and democracy, and they think that it's just that they have a different set of facts about who's threatening, that democratic order. But they still agree that the Constitution is a good thing, that free and fair elections are a good thing, and so forth. And so in that sense, I suppose the epistemic issue has displaced the moral one. But believe me, we still have lots of moral disagreements that in a way have gotten deeper with the passage of time. And the most important one is the subject of my new book on liberalism, which is a decline in the belief of liberalism itself, which I think we would have taken for granted 20, 30 years ago, but I don't think we can anymore.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a chance for a last word for all the people in the audience here. Is there anything you would tell them that you would have them do addressing any of these questions?
One of the things that I think we are lacking in our society is really this kind of Greek sense of moderation. I keep thinking about all of the commencement addresses in which the speaker tells the students to follow their passions, and this general cultural proclivity to admire people that take things to extremes, and by contrast, people that are moderate are just seen as weak-willed or insufficiently, strong-minded and not tough enough. And I think that that's an important Greek virtue that we need to cultivate, and we need to cultivate in our students as we teach them.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thanks everybody out there for coming.
Okay, thanks for inviting me, Alan.
It was a great conversation.
So long.